Okay, good evening, everybody. Before I forget, tonight's class is dedicated to Ila Nishmas Bilha Bastavor Abraham, and also Lahavda ben Chaim L'Chaim Mazel Tov, Rabbi and Mrs. Rappaport, my daughter and son-in-law, and the birth of a baby girl just born about less than an hour ago. So hot off the press, Baruch Hashem. I still wanted to make sure to do learning. I'm on Zadie duty here, so a little bit of an away game. I'm in the Rappaport's home, do my best here. But so happy to be able to share joyous and happy news. As advertised, Mazel Tov, thank you, Mazel Tov. As advertised, we're going to be starting a new Maamer, and it's a nice little hashkacha pratis, a nice alignment, because the Maamer is based on the story that dominates next week's parsha, as well as the haftorah associated with next week's parsha. So just a little background: this Maamer was taught by the Rebbe on Shabbos Parshas Shlach. That year, it was the 28th day of Sivan in 1976, Tafshin Lamed Vav. It was later distributed by the Rebbe in an edited form on 28th of Sivan, honor of 28th of Sivan, in 1988. 28th of Sivan is a red letter day in the world of Lubavitch. It's the day that the Rebbe miraculously arrived in this country with his wife in the middle of the war in 1942, and it was the last boat to sail through the Atlantic Ocean and make it safely to the United States. Maybe in honor of Chav Ches Sivan, we'll have somebody who can tell us more details about that story, but it's an important day in the world of Lubavitch, and one that merited that the Rebbe should say a Maamer on that day, and then later distribute that Maamer to the community in what's called the edited form. Now, this Maamer, as we mentioned, speaks about the primary theme of next week's parsha. So I want to give just a quick summary of the basic ideas, and then we'll start to dig into and at least cover a little bit. I know it's late now because of Maamer and so forth, so usually the Maamer class was a little longer, but in the summertime, we're going to keep it to about 20 minutes. Next week's parsha is called Parshas Shlach. Shlach means to dispatch as agents. And that is the beginning story, the first story of the parsha, that Hashem tells Moshe, Shlach l'cha, send, if you want, what we would call, not even spies, that's how they're disparagingly referred to, but reconnaissance men, people who will gather some information about this land that you are headed towards. And Moshe chooses the 12 best guys he could possibly imagine, the Nesiim, the leaders of the tribes. These are the top dogs. And he gives them very specific assignments as to what the data that they are to collect. And they come back after a 40-day journey, and 10 of the 12, and again, these are the top guys, 5/6 of them, the top guys, came back with such disparaging reports, such frightening descriptions of the land and the people in the land, that what has become a little bit of a well-known picture of 4 men carrying a rack of grapes, and these grapes like the size of bowling balls, to sort of demonstrate, wow, look at the size of the fruit. You can imagine what the people look like. I mean, the people are even more ginormous than that. And this freaked everybody out. And they started to say this was a bad idea, and we should have just stayed in Egypt. And why did you do this? Until 2 of the spies, Kalev, who happened to be married to Moshe's sister, Miriam, and Yehoshua, who was Moshe's protege and eventual successor, they see where this is headed, and they jump in and they say, no, we can do this, and don't give up, and so on. And the people become so despondent that they're ready to stone Moshe. And suddenly, at the last moment, just before that happens, Hashem appears, like the principal walks into the classroom just as the guy's got the water balloon ready to throw at the teacher. And Hashem says, that's it, I've had it with you. I am not I'm not taking you into the land of Israel. So imagine the worshiping of the golden calf. Hashem said, okay, I'll give you a chance to make that up. I'll give you a chance to fix it. But this, Hashem tells Moshe, with all of Moshe Rabbeinu's ability to, I'll use the word, and I mean this in a pleasant way, manipulate Hashem, to forgive the Jewish people. He says to Hashem, what will they say in Egypt? They'll say that you're incapable. You promised, you told us that, you told the ancestors. All of that, Hashem says no. This generation, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, who had this positive report and retained their certainty, their confidence, that Hashem would deliver the Jewish people as he promised into the land, everybody else between the ages of 20 and 60, above the age of 20, remember that was the census we took in the beginning of the book, in the beginning of the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, which represented sort of full-on adulthood, even though, of course, we usually think of adulthood in Torah as being the age of 13 or 12 for a girl, but full-on independent adulthood for holding them criminally punishable is age 20. That's that age of maturity, not just the age of adulthood. And they're all going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that generation dies out. That event that took place on Tisha B'Av, that's the first tragic event of Tisha B'Av. And of course, tragically, many other sad events followed on the Tisha B'Avs for years to come, including the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. Subsequent to this year, every year on Tisha B'Av, the people would dig graves. Can you imagine? And they would lay down in the graves. There would be such mass death that how would they bury everybody? And they laid down in these graves. And when the 40th year came, they lay down in the graves, and miraculously nobody died. And just to play that story out to its fullest, they got a little gun shy. They said, well, let's not celebrate so fast. Let's not make the mistake that we've made where we miscalculate and we get ourselves into trouble. Maybe it's not really the 9th of Av, maybe somehow we made a mistake. And so they laid down in these graves every night until the 15th of Av, when the full moon indicated to them that in fact the 9th must have passed, because it's the full moon, it's the 15th. Ipso facto, the decree was over, and the people could now start to plan to enter into the land of Israel. We know, of course, that Moshe Rabbeinu dies on the 7th of Adar. They have a month-long mourning period for Moshe Rabbeinu's death. Pardon me. They have a month-long mourning period for Moshe Rabbeinu's death and his appointed successor, Joshua. And there is no dispute that Joshua is in fact, pardon me, is in fact the successor to Moshe. He gets the word from Hashem that the 1 month mourning period for Moshe has expired, and it's time for him to lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And as we read in the book of Joshua, which is the book that picks up 30 days after the death of Moshe, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses have been completed, but the story goes on. We don't have this dramatic end where the curtain closes and then everybody goes home. The life goes on, and now the Jewish people have to push forward. And the next book that we have in our order of the prophets, it's now no longer the Chumash, it's not the Torah, but it's the Nun of Tanakh, it's the prophets, is the book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua begins with Hashem's affirmation of Joshua's leadership, Hashem's affirmation to Joshua that God will be with him, that God will support him as he supported Moshe. And now Joshua's got to take the reins. Okay, it's time to move forward. And the first thing that Joshua does, which is the stunning part and becomes the whole subject of the Maamer, is right there in the 2nd chapter of Joshua, after Hashem gives him this sort of pep talk. Now he's ready to take the reins himself. Now he's ready to be the leader. Here we go. What's his first act as leader of the Jewish people? He sends spies to go and scout out the land. Now, we, the readers of Torah, and we're going to read it, this is not this Shabbos, but next Shabbos, unless you're in Eretz Yisrael, where there are Shabbos Parsha ahead of us. We read the story in the Chumash about the sending of these men, these data gatherers, and they are referred to disparagingly as meraglim, as spies. Remember, that word has got a very negative connotation, as we see when Yosef accuses, again, under the guise that he is the viceroy of Egypt, and he wants to accuse or frame or blame or attack his brethren who have come down to Egypt. He says to them, meraglim atem, you are spies who have come to scout out the vulnerabilities of this land. So the term meraglim is a very disparaging term. It's what Yosef uses to attack his brothers. Again, he's pretending they're not the brothers. It's what Torah uses to refer to these men on the reconnaissance mission after the fact, to blame them, to attack them. And it is, ironically, what Yehoshua sends into the land. Chapter 2, verse 1, again, now Joshua, here we go. It says, Joshua sent 2 men as meraglim. So we're the readers of Torah, and we go, what are you doing? Joshua, you were one of the 2 out of 12 who were able to withstand the temptation to disparage the land of Israel. And just to double down on it, not only was it only 2 of 12 who were able to withstand Joshua and Caleb, even Joshua, we are told, would have fallen prey to the plan of the meraglim to disparage the land, were it not that before he went, Moshe Rabbeinu gave him such a profound bracha that it literally changed his name. His given name was actually Hosea, and it was changed to Yehoshua because Moshe added the Yud, so that his name now means Yud Hey, which is Hashem's name, Shua, which means to be rescued. God should rescue you. And Rashi tells us that were it not for this blessing, even he would have fallen prey to the temptation. So great was it for these men, what we call the spies, that when they saw what was going on, that they were intimidated. So that was sort of the reasonable thing. Even his partner, Kalev, who was married to Moshe's sister, and that might have given him a little bit of a boost to be somewhat of a Moshe loyalist, even he had to go and make a detour to Hebron, much like we go to the oil, in part learn from that, to daven at the grave sites of his ancestors, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and say, please don't let me get sucked into this plot. So even the 2 of the 12 who survived understand how difficult it is to do that. So the question is, based on this, why is it the first act of Yehoshua to send in 2 spies? Doesn't this threaten to bring us right back where we were? Doesn't this potentially set us up for another destructive circumstance? Why does Yehoshua think that this is a good idea? What are you thinking, man? This is potentially setting us up for the same problem we had 40 years ago. How could you do that? How could, fool me once type of thing? This becomes the theme of the Maamer, that we're going to look very closely at the difference between the spies, and I'll just use that word, even though they weren't intended to be spies, they were just intended to be data collectors, but we'll use that phrase, the spies that Moshe sent and the spies that Joshua sent. And why were the spies that Moshe sent unsuccessful, brought about travesty, resulted in the 40 years of wandering? And why is it that the spies that Joshua sent, on the contrary, laid the groundwork that allowed us to enter the land? And it can't just be that Joshua was a better spy picker than Moshe, because as we mentioned, the spies that Moshe chose were the top guys. They were, in fact, the cream of the crop. They were the best guys available. They were great people. And yet they fell prey to this. And as we mentioned, even Joshua and Caleb, who in fact resisted, would have fallen prey to it were it not for the special circumstances, the additional blessings from Moshe, from davening at the gravesites, as we talked about. This was what allowed Moshe, Yehoshua and Caleb to survive their ordeal. And yet here Joshua, the first thing he does seems to be, quote, the same mistake that Moshe makes. So this becomes the theme of the Maamer. And again, the lesson that we're looking for is not only the historical distinction between Joshua's, and again, I'm using the word spies, and Moshe's spies. Not only that, it is the personal level takeaway. What is it that we learn from the different attempts of the spies that Moshe sent and the spies that Joshua sent? So we do this, as we often do, by looking very closely, taking out sort of the magnifying glass to look at the wording and to try to find the indicator as to what is the difference between them. So we'll learn just the basically introductory paragraph, and then we'll continue, God willing, over the next weeks. So again, we begin with a quote from chapter 2 of the book of Joshua. Again, chapter 1 is essentially Hashem's affirmation that Joshua is the leader and the successor, and God will be with him, and so on. And then it says his first act as leader is, and sent Joshua 12, and again, it uses the word meraglim. Now remember, the word meraglim is a disparaging word. It's the word that is used to describe the spies post facto. And it's explained in Likutei Torah, which is authored by the first Rebbe. He picks up on this, and he has a Maamer on this exact idea. And he, again, picks up on this obvious, seemingly blunder. How could you do this? Of the difference between the spies that Joshua sent, who again were successful, and the spies that Moshe sent, who brought about travesty. So here we look a little closely. We look at the opening line of next week's parsha. Regarding the spies that Moshe sent, the pasuk says, Shlach lecha. That's next week's parsha's opening line. Translation, send to yourself, or as it's also explained, Hashem tells Moshe, send for yourself. I am not commanding you to do this. So Rashi fills in a little bit of the backstory. Remember, in this week's parsha, the Israelites, after a lot of preparation and fixing to get started, to get ready, to get going, they actually begin their journey to the land of Israel. They have been at Sinai for almost a full year. And they, of course, we had the 10 Commandments on Shavuos, and then the 40 days later, the golden calf, and that whole travesty, the connection with God via the construction of the Mishkan and that intensity, and then all of the lessons associated with how to operate the Mishkan, how to assemble it, how to operate it with the sacrificial processes, and so on. And finally, a little bit less than one full year after Shavuos, on the day of what we would call today the 20th of Iyar, so that's 2 days after Lag BaOmer. So we know Shavuos was a week ago, and Lag BaOmer a couple of weeks before that. So just to get your bearings, we finally pick up and we go, and here we go. And the next thing is, well, and this is what Rashi tells us, that people get a little squirrely, and they say to Moshe, wouldn't it be prudent for us to send in some reconnaissance men? That would be the responsible, smart thing to do. Now, Moshe is in a pickle when they come to him with this request. If he says yes, then he is potentially affirming their fear. And what are they afraid of? Hashem promised them this land. They should have no fear. Like Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, when he saw the Red Sea, he had no fear. He just kept going. God promised it. I have nothing to worry about. So the mere fact that they're double checking, if you ever had somebody double check you, I just want to make sure you didn't forget. I didn't forget. Remember, you said you were going to do it. I just want to make sure, it's a little bit insulting that they keep on double checking it, the double checking and the fact checking, the fact checkers. Simultaneously, if Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, he's hiding something. Why won't he let us send in a reconnaissance mission? Is because he's afraid what they're going to find. So Moshe Rabbeinu was stuck. So they use an analogy, as we would say, a used car salesman, but the analogy is a little predates cars. They call it a used donkey salesman. And they say that Moshe Rabbeinu employs a strategy of figuring that if I say yes, maybe that alone will assuage their concerns. So if the guy says, I want to take this donkey to my veterinarian, I want to take this used car to my mechanic, and the guy says, sure, do whatever you want. Sure, what do I care? Absolutely. Be my guest. Oh, you see, he's got nothing to hide. So Moshe Rabbeinu is in, as I said, a quandary. He turns to Hashem and he says, what should I do? And Hashem says, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You want to do it? Do it. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Now, in contrast to this, when Yehoshua sent the Meraglim, it seems that it was by Hashem's instruction. Okay, so that's one difference, but why does it result? Why? It doesn't really answer the question. We see it's different, but why, in fact, did Hashem command Yehoshua directly? And when Moshe turned to Hashem and said, what should I do? Hashem said, don't ask me. You do whatever you think is right. Whatever you think, I'll back you up, but I'm not making this decision for you. That's one. Another difference is Yehoshua's spies were only sent to the outskirts, the border of Israel, to the land called Yericho. And as we go through the Maamer, we'll go through some of the narrative to flesh it out a little bit more as well. In contrast, Moshe Rabbeinu sent his spies, and again, I'm just using the word spies, to scout out the entire land, width, depth, and breadth of the whole land. So those are two tangible distinctions between the two sets of spies. There's also another one, which we'll get to, which Joshua only sent 2 spies, and Moshe sent 12, and that'll become another idea that we will talk about. So we'll pause here for now. We'll continue next week. Again, thank you all for coming. Well, tomorrow night is Parsha, and we'll see you then. Good night, and Mazel Tov to everybody.